Well, good evening, everyone. Running a couple minutes behind, but I made it. Well, it's been a busy last few days, but good to be able to be here tonight, to be with you, and always look forward to these times we have together. If you would be opening your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, tonight we're going to be looking at verses 23 through 26. Hebrews 11, 23 through 26. Jared, would you lead us in a word of prayer? Amen. Tonight we're going to be looking at what will probably be the first of 3, possibly 4 lessons that we're going to glean from these passages here that talk about Moses. In this first lesson, we're going to devote our time to a subject that I can honestly say I've never taught a lesson or preached a lesson on, and it's a subject that I've never heard a lesson on. We're going to talk about the parents of Moses. And I think there's some great lessons that we're going to be able to take from just the little bit that we know about these two individuals. And then in the next lessons, we're going to then move into the faithfulness of Moses and some of the things that we remember about him. But first, we're going to look at the faithful example of Moses' parents. And so as we begin our lesson, let's look at our lesson text. We're going to focus mainly tonight on verse 23, but let's go ahead and let's read down through 26. It says, "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward." Now I want you to think with me for just a moment of what was taking place in Egypt at this time. The parents of Moses were faced with a terrible decision. On one hand, in order to honor the decree of Pharaoh, they would have had to have taken their newborn son and thrown him into the Nile River. On the other hand, in order to please God, they had to find a way to defy the king's decree, keep this child hidden, and thereby spare his life. We find that they displayed a faith-filled attitude because they made the decision that they were not going to go along with the king's decree. They were going to do the Lord's will. And so they had to find a way to keep this child hidden. You know, we all face times in life when we have to make decisions. Some of those decisions are seemingly insignificant, don't really have long-lasting consequences. But other decisions we make result in life-changing consequences. Sometimes those are positive and sometimes those are negative. But I think that we all would readily say that there have been times that we've all made bad decisions. There have been times that we look back now and maybe it seemed right at the time. But we look back and we think, why did I do that? It doesn't make sense to us now, but maybe it did then. And we understand that people have made all kinds of decisions that have led to changes that in many ways were quite dramatic. We think about bad decisions that people have made in regard to business. In 1938, there were two men, Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel. These men were cartoonists, and they had decided that they were going to invest in a new form of literature known as comic books. They created a comic book character, invested all of their savings into getting this on the market, and all of their efforts flopped. Finally, after a while, an investor came along and he said, I would like to purchase all of the rights to this character that you have created. He said, but I'm only going to pay you $130. Now, in 1938, $130 was a lot of money. And so to these men, they looked at the efforts that they had made up to this point, and they saw nothing but failure. And so they accepted this offer. The comic book character that they had created was called Superman. The Superman franchise is now worth $813 trillion. Yeah, that's a T. $813 trillion. That was a bad business decision. In 1955, Sam Phillips sold his rights to the royalties of a young Elvis Presley. He sold those rights to RCA Records for an unprecedented $5.4 million. Had he not sold those rights, he and his estate in the 68 years since that sale would have received over $100 million in royalties. We look at that and we think, that wasn't a very good decision. So we would agree that people have made bad decisions in business. We could also say that people have made bad political decisions. And one that I think applies very well to the lesson that we're seeing tonight. In the year 1979, China was facing a dilemma. They were running out of land. Families kept having more and more children, and many of them were living in poverty. They didn't have enough housing. They didn't have enough land for all of their population. And so the government of China decided, and they thought that it was a good decision at the time, that they would enact a new law which stated that each family from that point forward was allowed to have only one child. After a couple had had one child, if the woman became pregnant again, she was required by law to abort the child. And this was something that was required regardless of how many times in the future she got pregnant. She was required, after having one child, all of the others had to be aborted. Well, this led to the aborting of millions of Chinese babies. Millions and millions. Well, then, China decided in, what year was it? 2016, that in order to compete with the world, they needed to find a way to make their fertility rate look better. Of course, the fertility rates were so low because they were only allowing families to have one child. So in 2016, they changed the law to where each family could have 2 children. Well, it still didn't bring the rates up high enough, so in 2021 it was expanded to 3 children. Well, this law is still in effect. If a family has 3 children and the woman gets pregnant again, they have to abort that child. And even to this day, even with the expanding of this number, there's still an average of 10 million Chinese babies aborted every single year. Now, what if a family decides that they're going to defy the government? What if a Chinese family decides, I'm not going along with that. That's not right. Christian families in China have faced this problem head on. Well, what the law states is that if the government finds that you have not honored their rules in this regard, you are subject to a fine of at least, and I don't know how they come up with this number, but at least $31,250. You can serve up to a year in prison, and you can be physically beaten. All because you defied the king's order. The law states this way. It says to decide to keep a baby, these regulations or these punishments are intended to produce short-term suffering to the parents. Well, most residents of China have now come to see what a bad decision that was. It's not something that many of them agree with. But we find as well that many good decisions have been made. And whenever we look at Hebrews 11, 23 through 26, it is speaking of 2 good choices. And each of these good choices had an impact upon human history from that point forward. Now, the decision that faced Moses' parents, it may seem like that was pretty routine for the times. They were slaves. They had essentially lost all of their rights when a new dynasty of kings came in that didn't know about the agreement with Joseph. And they pressed them into hard labor. They had lost their rights. And when you have 2 slaves in Egypt who choose to defy their master, Pharaoh, this was something that was probably fairly common. The Jews, or the Israelites, they didn't like being in Egypt. They didn't like having to answer to Pharaoh. They knew that this was something that went against what the law of Moses would have stood for, or what the laws of God up to that point had stood for. And so they weren't going to go along with it. But we think about the decision that was made. The decision to spare this little boy. What did that decision lead to for that nation? It led to their deliverer being born. The one that would lead them out of Egypt and would lead them back to the promised land. Now you stop and you think, if they had taken Moses like the law declared, took him out and cast him into the Nile, the one that God had chosen to lead them out of Egypt, that ushered in this new period in the history of that nation, would not have come about. But in a display of faith, they honored God's will rather than man's will. Now, each one of these decisions that we're going to see here, they were motivated by faith. They have lessons with them that have eternal consequences for us. But each one of these lessons, each one of these decisions that were made, they teach us that the choice to obey God by faith, and here's something that I find interesting, and to borrow a term from the Chinese, sometimes to honor God and do His will brings about short-term suffering. But it brings about eternal blessings. So let's start out. Let's talk a little bit about Moses' parents and this decision that they had to make. Moses was the third child, the second son, born to a couple named Amram and Jochebed. His older siblings, he had a sister by the name of Miriam, he had a brother by the name of Aaron. But during this time, we find that the Israelites had gone from being just a small family, a small band of people. Remember, when they came from Canaan to live in Egypt, there were only how many? 70. They had now grown during this period of time, even while in slavery, to number roughly about 2 million. God blessed them to grow into a great nation. But Pharaoh began to look at them, and he saw how prolific they were, how fast that nation was growing, and he began to be afraid that they would rise up and overthrow Egypt, that they were going to challenge his authority. And so he passes this decree. In order to weaken that nation and keep them from growing as rapidly, all newborn boys were to be put to death. They were to be taken, they were to be cast into the Nile. Well, lo and behold, while this decree was in effect, Moses was born. The text says that his parents saw how beautiful he was. I don't think this is referring actually to his physical appearance. Every parent thinks their child's beautiful, whether they are or not. I think that what this is alluding to is that they recognized that there was something special. They recognized that God was going to use this young man to do something great for this nation. So when they looked upon him, and there's some indication in the text that it's not talking about a physical appearance, but it's talking about a recognition of his future accomplishments. They saw that this life was one that was truly going to be a blessing to many. And so they decided that they were not going to go along with the king's decree. But I want you to stop and think about something for just a moment. And especially, I'm going to ask the ladies this question. How hard would it be to keep a baby hidden for 3 months? You think about that. Every time that baby cried, I'm sure their heart sank. Every time that the soldiers of Pharaoh would come through the camp, I'm sure they were praying, please don't let him cry. Please keep him hid. So when we look at this, we could say that this kind of was short-term suffering on their part. There was such anxiety during this period because they were trying to keep this child hid. One of the sources that I looked at, it was talking about the fact that when you understand what a close-knit community that was and how the tribes were so close to each other people would have known. These children, the older siblings, they would have known that there was a baby in the house. And what happens with older siblings when they have a new baby brother or sister? They want to tell everybody. So one source that I looked at said, it's possible that during that 3-month period, they even had to keep Miriam and Aaron away from other people. They were doing everything in their power to keep the Egyptians from finding out about Moses. But verse 23 also told us that they were willing to do this because they were not afraid of Pharaoh. They weren't afraid of his command. They respected God's will. But then the question sometimes arises, if they weren't afraid of Pharaoh's command, why did they hide Moses? Think about that. If they weren't afraid of what might happen, why keep him hid for 3 months? Why not just say, we're going to obey God rather than man? Think about that. Well, we need to understand that trusting in God does not require us to take reckless chances. Just because they were not afraid of Pharaoh, just because they trusted that by doing God's will, everything would be okay, that didn't mean that they were going to walk out the house and go down the street carrying this baby out for the world to see. They didn't have to take these kinds of reckless chances. But we see that they did not fear Pharaoh's command because they defied it. If they truly feared it, they would have went along with it. But also, I would say that they probably did. Even though they trusted in God, I'm sure that they did still fear for their child's life. I'm sure that there was still anxiety there, but not only that, they were probably afraid for their own life. What's Pharaoh going to do to us if he finds out we've defied him? And so, yes, even though they weren't afraid of that to the point that they honored Pharaoh's command, it still produced anxiety on their part. It still produced this risk that they had to face. Because if Pharaoh's guards had caught them, not only was Moses at risk of being put to death, but remember, these were slaves, folks. They had no rights. They could be put to death as well. But we see from this, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, sometimes the choice to follow God has some initial upfront risks. In some parts of the world, those risks are more extreme than they are in other places. And remember, at this point, this couple, they didn't know what the outcome of their decision was going to be. They didn't know that Moses was going to be the deliverer of the people. They didn't know that he was going to grow up in the household of Pharaoh, rise to prominence in that way, and then eventually come back and lead them out. All they knew was, we've got this baby and we see something special here. We're going to protect him. But then we stop and we consider. Even though they could have taken what would be seen as the politically correct route. They could have said, well, that's the law. That's what we have to go along with. And they could have taken and thrown him into the Nile. Well, I'm sure this would have been an agonizing decision for them to make and for any parent to make. They could have said, well, that's the law. That's what we've got to do. How many times today do we see people, including Christian people, who make those kinds of decisions, who do things that they know is contrary to the will of God, but they justify it by saying, well, the law says it's okay. This is what our country tells us that we're supposed to do. This is what society tells us we're supposed to do. But this is where we come to this point where I say there's upfront risks. What happens if you dare to be different? If you dare to stand up to the status quo? If you don't go along with what society says is acceptable? You look different, you act different, you stand for different things. You're going to face the possibility of persecution. No, it may not be physical, like what we've seen in different eras of time. But how many times have we faced verbal criticism for the things we stand for? How many times have we been condemned for not going along with the whims of society or for the moral ideologies of the world rather than what God's will promotes? There's a short-term risk there. But we see eternal blessings. We see this in the example of Moses' parents. Although they did not know what the outcome was going to be, we see that the consequence of the decision, even though it put them through 3 months of a very trying time, very difficult situation. You look at the things that were accomplished for that nation because of the life of Moses. Because of what he worked out as the leader of that nation. Eternal consequences. We apply this, as we've been talking, to our decision to become children of God. While we may face short-term risks, and when I say short-term, that may be lifelong. But in the grand scheme of eternity, our life is a very short period of time. We may face short-term risks. We may live our entire life facing risks because of our faith in Christ Jesus. But what happens when we breathe our last and we are faithful to God? We receive the eternal blessing of a home in heaven. Why do we receive that? Because we kept our faith in God. We would not compromise and go along with the ways of the world. But coming back to the parents of Moses. They knew the risks were quite severe. They knew they stood to be in a position of grave danger. But they were not going to perform this sinful deed. The choice to obey God by faith, as we see in this example, sometimes does have risks. But let's talk a little bit more, bring all this together. Let's talk a little bit more about the blessings that come as a result of this decision that they made. Moses grew up to be one of the greatest leaders in Hebrew history. A man who was chosen by God to lead that nation. A man who, although he was not perfect, although he made mistakes, he was a man who tried to keep that nation focused upon doing the Lord's will. He delivered the Jews from slavery. We see that under divine inspiration, he wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. He received the law from Mount Sinai. He delivered that to the people. and this seemingly small routine choice that these parents made, that they were not going to let their child die. This led to huge consequences for the world. You know, we may never know what kind of blessings will be produced by the decisions that we make in life, because those blessings may manifest themselves generations in the future. We think about the example of faith that we display to our children, that we instill in them by bringing them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. How many times have we seen this type of situation present itself, where that child grows up, they leave the faith, their parent passes away, which causes them to remember that example of faith, and then that person comes to the Lord and becomes a faithful Christian? No, that parent left this life knowing that their child was in an unsaved state. But the blessing of the instilling of those values in that child continued to bear consequences even after that person's life had ended. So we may never know the effects that we have. We may never know how many generations into the future our decisions may bear fruit. We look at the example that we see here. Even to this very day, the Jewish people, they trace their heritage of faith back to one man, Abraham. Abraham had no idea what was going to happen after his generation. He knew that in some way, through his descendant, through his seed, that all families of the earth were going to be blessed. He didn't know how that was going to come about. He knew nothing of Jesus Christ. He knew nothing of the things that were going to transpire. He knew nothing about the law of Moses that served as a schoolmaster to prepare people. You know, there was so much that he did not know, that his decision to be faithful of God motivated for generations to come. Amram and Jochebed were the same way. They had no idea what was going to be accomplished through sparing that child's life. But we see that Moses came to accomplish many things. Things that he is still remembered for today. And I think it's important for us, and apparently the Holy Spirit thought that it was important enough to include the parents of Moses in these examples of faith, even though we don't talk about them near enough. We see here a powerful example of the influence of godly parents. These parents were not willing to compromise the will of God. They stood for what was right, and as a result, their child, his life was spared. He went on to be a great leader and a great example of faith. So we're going to stop there, and we will pick back up next Wednesday night with the story of Moses, and we'll begin talking a little bit more about some unique aspects of his faith rather than the faith of his parents.